Hey, I'm Scott Grove from Imagine Grove, and in this episode I'm going to show you how to do a crystal calcite inlays. Crystal calcite is great stuff. It's a clear mineral. You can dye it any color. Has a Mohs hardness of 3, which is soft from a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being mica, 10 being a diamond. So it sands real easy. And it's just a great effect. Here I've used it to create this inlay. And let me show how I did that.
I first sketch out the star on a piece of tracing paper over my chopping block so I can work out the proportions and then cut the star out. I played with the location a little bit, and once I figured out exactly where I wanted to go, I held it in place and then I just simply sketched that location out. Once I had the star sketched out, I cut the perimeter with an X-Acto knife using a French curve, working my way around, making 2 or 3 cuts on each line. Then with an 1/8 inch router bit on a trim router set about an 1/8 inch deep, I routed out the inside of the star, making sure I was far enough away from the line, which would be hand cut later. With a small chisel, I was easily able to place it into the kerf of the X-Acto knife and pare around the outside, following that line exactly. It went pretty quickly, using another chisel to pare out and remove the remaining material, keeping it all flush with the bottom. Then I went back to my X-Acto knife just to get the tips of the star nice and sharp and get that extra debris out. I also worked my way around and slightly undercut the parallel edges, just to sort of give a key, if you will, so my inlay would be surely locked in.
Okay, so now that I've routered and chiseled out my star, I'm ready to put my inlay in. But before I do that, I want to be sure that I seal the pocket. The crystal we're going to be dyeing, and I'm afraid there might be some pigment might leach into the maple, so that would be really bad. So we're going to mix a little epoxy, thin that down, and brush it inside the pocket to help seal those end grains. I'm also going to brush around the top surface also. That will also prevent any spillage from seeping in, and that will then get all sanded down. So since I'm going to be filling up this hole with epoxy, it's going to spill over a little bit. Now I do have the surface coated with epoxy, so I'm not too worried about it getting into the grain, but I'm still going to have all this extra material that I'm going to have to sand off or braid off in one way or another. So to help me speed things up, it's a good idea to just tape off the perimeter. This just helps. I can tape off rough, meaning close to the line. I can tape over and cut to the surface. This will protect the surface, but it's still the same level. And to help prevent air bubbles from accumulating to the top, if you had a dam and built this thing up a little bit, then the material will have sort of a reservoir on top, and any air bubbles that are stuck towards the top will be above the surface. So for that, sometimes I just take clay and I'll make a little dam. And lastly, if you don't have clay and still want a dam, you can also use silicone. I'm not really worried about the surface because again it's protected. I can just lay a bead of silicone down directly on the wood, or if you are concerned about the silicone, you can put the silicone over the tape. So basically I'm showing 3 or 4 different methods here to kind of protect the area. In fact, what I might do is, let's take one of these off. So I'll leave this one here and show you the difference. So a few things you're going to need here to dye your calcite. First, you need a mixing container. I use glass or a coffee can, can't use plastic. You want to use, have some denatured alcohol. I put my little squirt bottle, shellac, and I like trans tint. Trans tint is an alcohol-based, highly concentrated dye, if you will. And you need a torch and some mixing sticks and mixing containers, and of course the calcite. So let me show how I do this. I'm going to show you 2 different ways. The reason I'm going to show you two different ways is because every application has a different scenario. The calcite I get in two different grinds. A fine, which is a number 12, very, very fine, and this is great for very small cracks and inlays, maybe up to 1/8 inch wide. But for larger gaps, I want to get the 412. This is a much coarser grain. What I like to do is mix these roughly 50-50 into the mix. So the coarse will fill in the large gaps, and then the fine kind of fills the gaps between there. These are 2-ounce cups, so that's probably about 1.5 ounces of calcite that I'm using. I put this in here. So for every ounce of calcite, I find about 3 drops of the trans tint. But again, this is highly concentrated. So if you want a lighter blue, put less. If you want a darker blue, you put more. There's about 9 drops. There's a nice rich sapphire color. There comes the fun part. So I also put about the same amount of alcohol in there. I'll mix that up, thoroughly coat it, and now I take my torch and I light that on fire. You can see that's burning, and you want to be careful. And if you stir that up, you're going to increase the fire. So be very careful when you do this. That's still burning, and you got to be careful because the alcohol you can't always see. Want to stir that around, make sure all that alcohol is burned off. There's still a flame there. And there we go. Baked on the calcite, and that color is sort of set. For larger voids, I'll be using epoxy. And with epoxy, I found just putting the trans tint into the epoxy works just fine. For finer cracks, where I'm using CA glue, I also like to seal the dye on with just a little shellac. So I'll pour a little shellac in there.
Keep stirring the calcite and make sure all the shellac is dry. This prevents it from sticking together. You can also spread it out on some wax paper. That will also aid in the drying.
Again, I don't do this process when I'm doing the larger voids. This is how I dye the calcite for the finer. Okay, since I've coated this board with epoxy, now I want to make sure I have a mechanical bond. I'm just going to scuff up the bottom here as best I can. In addition, I'm a little concerned about this might being translucent and seeing this stripe go through here. So I want to coat this with a little black. So I'm going to take a little Blendall powder, some shellac, and I'm going to paint the entire bottom here to kind of blend that all in. And shellac acts as a good tie coat, so I'm not too worried about it inhibiting any adhesion. Actually, it might help it. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and mix up our epoxy. The epoxy that I like to use is the G-Flex by West System or Goujon Brothers. This is specifically designed to accommodate any expansion-contraction issues there are in irregular materials. So if you're gluing metal to wood or glass, it is a little thicker, so I'm concerned about my viscosity, and I'll show you how we're going to get around that. This is really great stuff to use. It mixes 50-50. Simply squeeze both together. I'm going to guesstimate that I need about 1 ounce. That should be more than enough. And I'm going to go ahead and thoroughly mix this together. I think I might get a larger cup. You want to make sure this is mixed really well. So now I'm going to add my calcite. How much, you say? Well, it's just by eye. Now there's another thing I like to use. I like to use mother of pearls. And this adds just a little sparkle. I don't know if you can kind of see the sparkle there. But I like to add kind of a pinch of each. And what that does is the mother of pearl has a little pearlescence to it. And adds just a little shimmer to my mix. And there's still a flow. It's important that it will still flow. I don't know if you can see that. So now I'm just going to kind of trowel this stuff in here, making sure it gets to all the corners. And you can see it's quite thick. This is probably about 10 to 15,000 centipoids. So it's important I want to raise the viscosity here. I could add a little thinner. In this case, I'm going to skip that step, and I'm going to use a heat gun. So a heat gun will heat the material up, lower the viscosity, and pop all the bubbles all at the same time. And you can see it makes it flow. So I want to make sure something I can use just the air to push it. But you see how more fluid this is now? And it's popped a lot of those air bubbles that are trapped in there. You can also see the damming effect. So this area right here is higher than the surface, and any bubbles that are floating up to the top will be above the surface, as opposed to over here, any bubbles that might be trapped sort of at the top might be halfway above and halfway below my wood, and that could be a problem down the road. It's not uncommon to have a few surface bubbles, and we'll go back and fix them later. One other step that I want to do here, though, is flame it. This is a flaming method for if you're doing, say, epoxy counters and what have you. I light the torch and I'm just going to lightly dust the surface. That will pop any bubbles that are on the top. I'll also come back in 5 minutes and do it again, because some bubbles will slowly migrate to the top, and this will keep popping them. It's been about 5-10 minutes, so I'm going to flame it one more time. So now my epoxy is all hard. As you can see, I can certainly peel off my masking tape. That helps protect the material. The silicone will also peel off real easily. The clay comes off too. But they all look pretty well. The next thing is I need to level this down. So to do that, I can either sand it real hard with a sander and just grind my way down. What I like to use is a router. I use an extended router base, and then I take just a piece of MDF, and by double sticking this on, I can ride over the flat surface, and the router bit, the base won't hit the raised area.
Simply route for one direction and work your way over the high resin.
You can start seeing that the star is starting to show. A little sanding, I'll get this extra residue off. Some of this is clay, so I'm probably going to want to scrape that off so I don't gum up my paper.
I start with 80 grit, work my way to 120, and finish with 180 and 220.
Oh, look at that. That's looking pretty damn good. I'm feeling really good about that, so I'm going to go ahead and sand the entire table.
Here I sand all the protective epoxy off with 120, and then I go to 180 and 220, which gives me a nice final surface on my cutting board.
I don't know if you can see or not, but there's a couple fine holes here. There's two right here, and a medium size or a small one right there. Oh, here's another one over here. And this is not uncommon to get these little air pockets. So what I'm going to do is fill that with some of the calcite. Take some of my calcite. I'm going to try to get the fine powder here. And I don't need much. But to make it even finer, I'm going to take a hammer and just crush that up really, really fine. I'm just going to take a little of that and fill those holes. Simply take some super glue and drop that on there.
A final complete sanding with 220, and I'm ready for some mineral oil for my finish.
Hope you enjoy the episode, and feel free to visit imaginegrove.com for more information on the crystal calcite or other tools that are available that help me make this. So, God bless America.